bald eagle just wasn't on our radar in the 1970s as something that we would see in this particular area.
Sightings go back certainly several decades, but maybe mid 90s, late 90s, something changed.
It's the rediscovering by the bald eagles of historic wintering areas.
The bald eagle is definitely at the top, size-wise, and especially in this area, they are the largest bird you'll find.
It looks like it's a quality of life thing. People move to certain areas for the quality of life, and I think that the eagles are here because of the quality of life here.
We lost it, but now we've got that back, and we should be celebrating that.
The majestic Grand River as it flows through one of the fastest growing urban areas in Canada. Kitchener to the left, Cambridge to the right. Starting north of Fergus, the Grand River twists and snakes its way more than 300 kilometers to spill into Lake Erie. Through this teeming urban area, it passes nearly 1 million humans whose communities line its banks. Polluted and abused for decades, the Grand sparkles again today. Early in this century, it was designated a Canadian Heritage River. Now, along this spectacular ribbon of life, we discover a secret. The Grand River holds perhaps the greatest story of ecological recovery since the rebirth of Lake Erie itself. Here, in the Grand River watershed, is bald eagle country. One century ago, Lake Erie was home to a pair of bald eagles for about every mile of shoreline. By the 1970s, humans had cut that to just 3 nesting pairs, and none of them was producing any offspring.
The Grand was a territorial area for nesting bald eagles, and as such, the Grand River would have been a wintering area for migrating bald eagles, which is part of what you see here. These birds are coming from outside of the Grand River basin, and they are accessing the Grand River for wintering purposes.
Bald eagles were decimated, I guess you could say, continent-wide by a number of factors. One of them would have been human persecution. In the States, for example, between 1917 and 1952, bounty was paid on 128,000 bald eagles. There were a number of factors, and habitat destruction would be one of those. Finally, the most obvious, and the one that many people are aware of, was the presence of DDT and PCBs that got into the food chain.
The other thing is that in the 40s and 50s, the water quality of the river was very low, and we know that fish populations in the river are a lot better now than they were in the 40s and 50s. And again, with healthy fish populations, those are the kinds of things that are going to attract things like bald eagles into the area.
KW Field Naturalist Club records show that bald eagles were a breeder on the Grand River system south of Cambridge back in the 1930s and 1940s. We have anecdotal evidence from some reliable sources to indicate that birds were breeding at that time. There was one nest, for example, not too far from Glen Morris, between Glen Morris and Paris.
The decline was associated to environmental pollution. The decline was attached to the pesticide story, where the reproduction was being impaired due to chemicals. The reproduction impairment caused a break in the bald eagle family tree, where we were not getting continuance of generations from grandparent to grand fledgling, and that interruption of the tree caused the population to decline.
We walk the dog here regularly 3-4 times a day. There's always people down looking, eagles, birds, all kinds of different things. And there's a gentleman here with a tripod, and he said, "You want to see an eagle?" And I said, "What do you mean you see an eagle?" He said, "There's a bald eagle." So we looked, and far in the distance, probably 300 meters away, there's a cracked willow. And sure enough, there was a bald eagle in the cracked willow. Look at the eagle, you couldn't really tell how big it was, and then you see a crow in the same tree beside it. The eagle has some authority. Big bird.
The date that I keep in mind is in February 1994. From this particular location on the Grand River, just upstream from the Fountain Street Bridge in Cambridge, I received a phone call from one of the residents who had seen a very, very large bird standing very close to the ice and looked as if it was feeding on a carcass of some kind. And sure enough, there's a bald eagle feeding on the ice. I would say that since 1999-2000, we've been seeing birds not only regularly, but a number of birds.
The birds are here to feed, they're here to eat. And so you've got open water, because the sewage treatment plant outflow, shallow water. So there's a lot of fish here, a lot of ducks and stuff for birds to feed on. And so they've got all their needs. There's a lot of perching trees along the river where they can sit. You know, most of the time they're just sitting in these trees, waiting for something to come by. And it's something you have to see for yourself. I mean, a lot of people have seen hawks and whatnot, but you see one of these eagles, and if someone points it out to you, you know that, just the way it flies, or just a huge bird, just a very, very graceful bird.
It's exciting. It's historic. The bald eagle in the Grand River, pre-European settlement, was probably much larger than it was today, and in the Grand River it was probably extirpated or not even occurring in the 1970s, 1980s. But the return of the bald eagle today in the Grand indicates, first of all, we have a nesting pair, and then we have wintering habitats which are attracting upwards of 7-8 birds over the winter. They're rediscovering their lost ranges, and it's exciting to watch.
The bird is very much an indicator of environmental health. And I think that's one of the reasons that bald eagles are so important for us, is that they tell us something about the health of our environment.
It looks like it's a quality of life thing. People move to certain areas for the quality of life, and I think that the eagles are here because of the quality of life here. In other words, if this wasn't a good area for them for feeding, if the river wasn't clean, if the environment wasn't good for them, they wouldn't be here.
The Grand River has a number of features along some of its length, and perhaps some of the features that make it bald eagle wintering habitat are best expressed in what we see at the confluence of the Speed and the Grand River here in Cambridge. Imagine, if you will, that you were sitting in the crack willow tree just above the confluence. From that vantage point, you have a view up and down river for a considerable distance because you're on the floodplain. The river itself is reasonably shallow. For much of its length, it's below knee depth in many places. And the river is also, for the most part, open during most of the winter, many of the winters along this area. As well, there are key perch sites on crack willows or other types of deciduous trees very close to the river, within 30 meters, and they make good hunting sites for bald eagles. The confluence of the Speed and Grand River in Cambridge is the premier waterfowl wintering area in Waterloo region. That particular area has a very good fish stock of several species along these reaches above and below the confluence. Historically, this particular area has been occupied by humans from 9,500 years ago up until present, and they would be taking advantage of the fish, of the wildlife, and of course, much more recently, for the last several hundred years, because it's good agricultural land.
The purpose of the monitoring is to be able to find out what are critical habitats for the bald eagle. Now, the bald eagle's been seen flying over the 401. They've been seen flying over the city of Cambridge and Kitchener. But at what point do we call something bald eagle habitat? Because the implications of that are, if we call it bald eagle habitat, the Endangered Species Act talks to that, and the provincial policy statements talk to that, and it's our mandate to protect those habitats for the bald eagle. By observing the eagles, by getting information from the many people that are out there observing eagles, we're learning more about the bird, and we're able to say these elements of the Grand River watershed are important for the bald eagle. They're part of its habitat. Good spots, Dune, and the 401. If you can get up above the 401 and have a look at the river as it's going under the 401, that's a good spot. Blair area and what we call the confluence, or where the Speed and the Grand Rivers come together, that's always been a good spot. There's the first bridge south of Cambridge, which is called the Footbridge. That's a good spot. Eagles have been seen upstream and downstream of it. The next bridge down, which is the Glen Morris Bridge, has been a good spot as well to see eagles. And in some years, you can see birds around Paris as well.
If you were to go south of Cambridge, along the Galt Ridge, the Carolinian Ridge that extends all the way down to Paris, there are a number of isolated and well-protected sites along the slopes there that would give bald eagles roosting sites.
There's two eagles in Ontario. There's the bald eagle and there's the golden eagle. Both birds are dark-bodied and are very commonly confused, but that's the first year or two of the life cycle for a bald eagle. A bald eagle, when it becomes a 3-year-old, the tail starts to change its color to becoming a white-colored tail. And then in year 4, the white tail is very predominant, and then the head color starts to change to becoming a white head. So by year 5, you have a black-bodied bird that has a white tail and a white head.
They just have a very unique way of flying, a very sort of laborious wing flap. The distance that you have to stay away from the eagle depends on what you're doing. So you can probably hear in the background Highway 401. And the bald eagles have been seen flying right over 401, and in a couple cases they've been seen in trees maybe 50 meters from the 401. Bald eagles are able to tolerate that kind of thing because it's sort of a predictable, constant kind of thing, and they're used to that. There's sort of no surprises for them. The scientific literature is quite clear that the things that bald eagles are not very tolerant of are sort of sporadic, unpredictable things, like people walking on a trail or people fishing in the river near eagles. Bald eagles can't predict that. People come and people go. And so that kind of activity has the most potential to disrupt eagles. So back to your question, if an eagle's perched in a tree, ideally you should not be coming within 300 meters of that eagle.
In order to ensure Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources experts would participate in this program, our cameras have maintained that distance. To get close up to a bald eagle, we're going to the Mountsburg Wildlife Center in neighboring Halton Region.
The one you'll probably see sitting down on the lower perches, his name is Phoenix, and he is here because he caught his wing in a wolf trap. He went after the bait. This was a long time ago. He's been here since 1979. He went after the bait in the trap, and unfortunately I closed over his wing, and his wing just they weren't able to save it, so they had to take that off. And I think that's how he damaged his beak as well. He's lost the hook to his beak. Cornelius, our other bald eagle, he's the one that sits on the higher perches, and I believe he got into a car accident when he was still fairly young and injured his wing. It's somewhat, looks like it's dislocated. It didn't heal properly afterwards, and he's also injured the lower part of his beak. It's quite often a stressful reaction that you find out of them. They get worried, they get upset, they fly away, they run away. And that can do as much damage to them as it can do to us. Stress isn't good for anyone, so that is another reason to stay away from them, is that they do get stressed out pretty easily.
Bald eagles are wildlife. They are a solitude-seeking animal, and they have their bounds of human tolerance. And in the southern Ontario, in the Grand River area, we have to allow space. We have to give them room, or they will leave.
We also observe birds in courtship behavior, particularly as we get into the latter half of February and into early March. One of the things that eagles will do during courtship is that the lead eagle will turn 90 degrees or even 180 degrees and present its talons to the one behind it. And in some instances you'll see them what is called talon touching. And that's a form of courtship behavior.
Even from that safe distance experts insist on to avoid distressing the eagles, this is historic. A full plumage adult and an immature bald eagle perform pre-mating ritual flight over the Grand River in Cambridge.
It's a pair bonding behavior. It's a socializing behavior. And at that time of year, it's a pairing bond behavior where birds are starting to learn and establish mating futures.
If we decide that we can coexist with them, there's no reason to think that they couldn't be breeding somewhere in the Grand River watershed.
There is reason to believe bald eagles will soon nest close to the more densely populated stretches of the Grand River in Waterloo Region. The Grand is no longer just winter habitat. Long after winter is over, the eagles are still here. And closer to Lake Erie, there is an active eagle's nest. But human activity and a lack of real protection almost destroyed it, just days before our cameras found it. Here, in a secluded grove on the Grand River, somewhere close to Lake Erie, an adult pair of bald eagles has been producing at least 2 healthy offspring per year since the 90s. Across southern Ontario, there are about 30 active nests, but this one was almost destroyed. The very day after our flight in search of the eagles, near disaster. The tinder-dry marshes of the Grand River upstream from Lake Erie are set ablaze. Fire burns for hours. Already, likely because of human intrusion here, the wary eagles had abandoned the nest they had used for several years. Less than 200 meters away, they have built a new nest. During the marsh fire, heavy smoke drifted past the nesting site, but both the female and male are vigilant. Their eggs have survived.
The population today has remained endangered, but it is a population now that has undergone a fragile rehabilitation. The bald eagle has returned to the shorelines of the Great Lake Basin. The bald eagle has returned to the mainland portions of the Great Lake Basin, and they are reproducing.
My question is, wouldn't it be nice if we could also share habitat with something like a bald eagle?
It certainly reflects very favorably on our rehabilitation efforts from the 1970s through to present. It also shows us that the environment has cleaned up and we're on the right path because the population has grown. But it's more exciting on the Grand that we've seen this rediscovery of vacant or lost habitat ranges, and the birds are now returning. And that tells us that the environmental habitats related to pesticides and the bald eagles are in fact improving.